pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, knight c6, knight c3, pawn e6, pawn d5, pawn e takes d5, pawn c takes d5, knight e5, pawn e4, bishop c5, bishop f4, knight fg4, knight h3, castles, bishop e2, pawn d6, castles, queen f6, knight b5, pawn c6, knight c7, rook b8, queen d2, bishop d7, knight g5, pawn h6, knight f3, bishop b6, pawn d takes c6, bishop takes c7, pawn c takes d7, knight takes d7, pawn h3, knight ge5, rook a c1, bishop a5, queen takes a5, queen takes f4, knight takes e5, pawn d takes e5, queen takes a7, knight f6, queen e3, queen takes e3, pawn f takes e3, rook a8, bishop c4, knight takes e4, rook fd1, rook fd8, rook d5, rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, knight f6, bishop b3, rook d8, pawn a4, king f8, rook c7, rook d7, rook takes d7, knight takes d7, pawn a5, knight f6, king f1, king e7, king e2, knight e4, bishop d5, knight d6, pawn e4, pawn g6, pawn g4, king d7, bishop takes b7, king e6, pawn a6, knight b5, pawn b4, king d6, king d3, king c7, bishop d5, king b6, bishop takes f7, pawn g5, bishop e6, king takes a6, king c4, knight d4, king d5, knight f3, king c5, knight g1, bishop c4, king a7, bishop f1, knight f3, pawn b5, knight d2, bishop d3, king b7, bishop c2, king c7, king d5, knight f3, bishop b3, knight d2, bishop c4, knight takes c4, king takes c4, king d6, pawn b6, king c6, pawn b7, king c7, king d5, king takes b7, king takes e5, king c7, king e6, king d8, king f7, king d7, pawn e5, king c7, pawn e6, king c6, pawn e7, king d5, pawn e8, king d4, king g6, king d5, king takes h6, king c4, king takes g5, king d5, pawn h4, king c4, queen e4, king c5, pawn h5, king d6, pawn h6,